Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
There are moments in life that seem small when they happen fleeting, almost forgettable, but when you look back, you realize everything that came after began there. For me, it was a family game night, a Saturday I wasn't even supposed to attend, a gathering I only showed up for out of guilt and habit. I brought a bottle of wine I knew no one would drink, wore jeans a little too nice for my mother's plastic-covered chairs, and smiled just enough to avoid the usual "you've changed" jabs that always floated in the air like the faint scent of her rose potpourri. And yet, somewhere between the second round of charades and my third glass of water, because Lord knows I wasn't about to drink anything my brother brought, he said it. Just blurted it out like we were still in high school and I still had acne and dreams bigger than I was allowed to voice in that house. "You'd never last in a real job," Eric said, grinning, tossing the phrase out like a casual insult during a football game, like we were still teasing each other across the dinner table about who got the last roll. Only this time, I didn't laugh. I didn't even blink. I just felt my stomach turn cold, like someone had poured ice water straight down the center of me, not because it was unexpected, but because it wasn't. He said it with that smirk I knew too well, the one that always came before he pushed too far, knowing someone would bail him out. Knowing Mom would sigh and say, "Oh, he's just playing," and Dad would pretend not to hear it, and someone would change the subject before I had a chance to answer. But this time, there was no scramble to cover for him. No nervous laughter, no awkward throat clearing from the peanut gallery of blood relations. Just the soft clink of a teaspoon against porcelain as Grandma June stirred her tea, slow and deliberate, and looked up with eyes sharper than I remembered them being. She didn't raise her voice or even look at Eric directly. She just sipped her tea, placed the cup down on its saucer, and asked with a calm so cutting it nearly sliced the air in half, "Is that why she's your boss now?" That silence, God, that silence. You could hear it settle on everyone's shoulders like dust in a locked attic. You could hear it in the way my mother's breathing caught in her throat, in the way Eric blinked and looked away, suddenly fascinated by the edge of the Monopoly board, in the way my father shifted in his seat as if he suddenly felt the couch was made of nails. It was the kind of silence that doesn't come from confusion or discomfort, but from recognition, from the undeniable realization that something had just cracked wide open, and none of them were quick enough to tape it back together. I smiled. Not big, not smug, just enough. Because Grandma June wasn't known for taking sides, not openly. She was a relic of an era where women swallowed their words and stirred their tea while the world passed them by, but I'd always known there was more behind her quiet eyes. She'd watched this family long enough to see all the lines drawn, all the roles assigned and played and rehearsed for decades. And with one sentence, she'd burned the entire script. I watched Eric sit back, trying to brush it off like a joke that didn't land, like he hadn't just been publicly undressed in front of the one person whose approval he craved more than anyone else's. That's the thing about men like my brother. They're so used to being the golden child, the family clown, the charming screw-up everyone forgives, that when someone finally calls their bluff, they don't know what to do except smirk harder and wait for someone to rescue them. But no one did. Not this time. I should have let it go. I should have just enjoyed the moment, felt the satisfaction for what it was, and moved on. But something inside me, something cold and methodical and very much awake, clicked into place. Because that wasn't just a joke. It wasn't even about me, really. It was a reminder. A reminder of every time I'd sat at that same table and been dismissed, every time my successes had been framed as luck or timing, every time I'd been told I was too much or not enough in the same damn breath. I had worked my ass off, 15 years in logistics, starting from the floor of a freezing warehouse in Chicago, pulling night shifts while studying for my certification, getting promoted not because someone handed it to me, but because I earned every inch of respect I had. And now I ran an entire region. I had 47 people reporting to me. I made decisions that impacted millions in revenue. And my little brother, who had been bailed out of 3 jobs, whose resume read like a Craigslist ad, who showed up to work in wrinkled khakis and still couldn't spell logistics without autocorrect, had the audacity to insult me in my own mother's living room. So no, I wasn't going to let it go. I didn't explode. I didn't argue. I didn't throw my wine in his face like in some soap opera. I just sat there and let the silence do the work, let Grandma's words echo in the stillness until the board game felt like an artifact from a civilization that didn't matter anymore. Later that night, as everyone shuffled into the kitchen for dessert, pretending nothing had happened, I stayed behind in the living room, watching the ceiling fan spin like it had been doing the same tired routine for decades. I thought about all the times I'd tried to prove myself to people who only wanted me to stay small. I thought about all the years I'd swallowed my success to keep the peace. And I decided, in that quiet room with nothing but the hum of the fridge and the ticking of the wall clock to keep me company, that I was done apologizing. Eric thought his little jab was harmless. Just a joke. But what he didn't know, and what no one else in that house seemed to realize, was that this time, he hadn't just insulted me. He had challenged me. And I wasn't the kind of woman who left challenges unanswered. No. This time, I was going to show them all exactly what a real job looked like. Starting with my dear little brother. There's something unsettling about the way some people float through life with the cushion of undeserved confidence. People who've never truly paid the price for their mistakes, because there's always been someone standing nearby, wallet or words in hand, ready to clean up their mess, brush it under the rug, and slap a grin on their face, as if consequences were just optional decorations only meant for other, less fortunate souls. Eric was the kind of man who'd been handed too many second chances by people who mistook charm for competence, and for far too long I had been one of those people, exhausted, overworked, under-acknowledged, and still willing to let it slide when his failings landed in my lap, simply because he was my brother, and because I thought that maybe, just maybe, loyalty was more important than accountability. He got the job 6 months ago, and not because he deserved it or even applied for it properly, but because my mother had called me late one night, her voice soft with guilt and suggestion, asking if there was anything open in my department, anything small, something that could help him get back on his feet after his latest stint of unemployment. And I, in a moment of weakness, or perhaps some leftover sense of familial obligation, had done what I had sworn I wouldn't. I let him in. I told HR to add his resume to the pile, and I spoke a single sentence in the hiring committee meeting that tipped the scale. He's rough around the edges, but he's smart. What I didn't say was that I had never actually seen him prove that intelligence in any meaningful way. From the start, the signs were there. He showed up late twice in his first week and blamed traffic. He forgot to reply to urgent client emails and once accidentally copied a supplier on an internal chain that included salary breakdowns. I wrote it off as adjustment issues, gave him time, space, and even covered for him when he missed a deadline on a logistics rerouting analysis that cost us $4,000 in shipping fees. But the worst part wasn't the mistakes, it was the smugness, the assumption that none of it really mattered, that his last name was armor thick enough to deflect any consequences. He strutted around the office like it was a favor we were doing for him, not the other way around. And while everyone whispered behind his back about the boss's incompetent brother, no one dared say it to his face or mine. But things reached a boiling point last Thursday. I was reviewing quarterly reports when I noticed a strange discrepancy in one of the warehouse audit logs. It wasn't huge, just a small, recurring data point that didn't align with the numbers from our inventory system. I wouldn't have caught it if I weren't obsessively detailed, but I am, because unlike my brother, I've had to be. I dug deeper, spent 3 hours cross-referencing shift reports and driver logs, and then finally landed on something that turned my stomach, a falsified report, clearly edited and digitally signed by me. Submitted under Eric's login credentials, but altered just enough to mask the fact that he'd rerouted an entire shipment without approval. The mistake cost us close to $12,000 in client penalties, and he had tried to bury it by faking my authorization. At first, I couldn't believe it. I stared at the screen like maybe it was wrong, like maybe I was overreacting, or maybe some intern had made a mistake. But as I followed the trail, as I matched the timestamps and read the digital footprints, the truth became undeniable. Eric had not only messed up, he had tried to cover it by implicating me. And that's when something in me hardened. It wasn't rage. Rage is hot and impulsive. This was cold. It was still. It was the feeling of a door finally closing on something I had kept open for far too long. I knew what I had to do. But I also knew I wasn't going to do it the way he would expect. I wasn't going to confront him in the office, or send a dramatic email, or scream across a boardroom table. I was going to do it the way professionals do. Quietly. Efficiently. Irrefutably. So I created a secure email address. I pulled the full audit trail, documented every error, every falsified report, every edit, and every timestamp. I wrote a formal complaint as if I were just another employee, an anonymous whistleblower reporting a serious breach. I attached the files. I encrypted everything. And I hit send to HR with the subject line, potential fraudulent activity, immediate attention required. The next morning, I sat across the conference table from Eric during our usual Thursday check-in meeting, and he didn't know a thing. He was wearing that same smug expression, tapping his pen on the table, talking about how boring the freight assignments have been lately, and asking if I could throw something more interesting his way. I smiled. I nodded. I told him I'd think about it. Because that's how you get to someone like him, not with screaming, but with silence. Not with confrontation, but with preparation. And I wasn't finished yet. That weekend, at brunch with my parents, my mother leaned across the table with a tight smile and asked if everything was all right at work. She said she'd heard from Eric that things had been hectic, and I could hear it in her tone, the defense, the warning, the unspoken suggestion that if something went wrong, it was probably because I was too intense, or rigid, or not flexible enough with people. That's always been the code in our family. When Eric messes up, we all tighten ranks. We all pretend it didn't happen. We all tell ourselves that he's trying, that he just needs support, that the world is hard and he's fragile, and I, with all my efficiency and structure, just don't understand. But I do understand. I understand more than they think. And that's why I'm done protecting him. Because here's the thing, when you spend your whole life being told to make room for someone else's shortcomings, you start believing that your strengths are problems. When you're the daughter who succeeds without help, they call you distant. When you set boundaries, they call you cold. And when you finally refuse to carry someone else's failure on your back, they say you're selfish. But I'm not selfish. I'm done being silent. And if my family thought that game night jab was the end of it, they had no idea what I was really capable of. Because this time, I wasn't going to cover the wound. I was going to show them the scar. There is a particular kind of silence that doesn't come from peace, or calm, or even fatigue. It comes from a lifetime of choosing to bite your tongue until you're left with nothing but blood and bitterness. A silence that festers beneath polite smiles and holiday dinners, where everyone knows the rules, but no one ever dares to write them down. That was the air in my parents' house the week after the email was sent to HR. It was the same house I grew up in. The same cracked driveway and creaky porch swing, the same lemon-scented cleaner my mother used to wipe down every surface twice over before company came, except now it carried a heaviness that couldn't be mopped away, a strange awareness that the balance had shifted and no one quite knew why, only that it had, and it wasn't going back. Eric didn't call. He didn't text. He didn't even show up to work for 2 days, which wasn't unusual enough to raise flags in most departments, but I noticed it immediately. Not because I was watching him, no, I had stopped doing that a long time ago, but because part of me still, stupidly, held on to the hope that maybe he would be the one to come clean. To step into my office and sit down with his tail between his legs and admit what he had done, not just the falsified report or the mess he'd created, but all of it, the years of undermining, the whispered jokes, the smug entitlement. But, of course, that didn't happen, because men like my brother don't apologize, they strategize. They look for angles, loopholes, someone else to blame. And when they sense the walls closing in, they don't reflect, they retaliate. On the 3rd day, he came into work looking like a man rehearsing innocence. He wore a collared shirt, tucked in too neatly, hair combed with more effort than usual, and walked past my office without even a glance in my direction. I knew then that HR had called him in. I also knew he denied everything. The beauty of an anonymous report, paired with irrefutable digital records, is that denial becomes noise. Still, HR operates like a slow-moving train, steady, cautious, and painfully thorough, and while they reviewed the documents and conducted internal interviews, life outside that office ticked on as if nothing had changed. But something had. And it wasn't just between Eric and me. It was the way our mother started calling every other day, her tone sweet and strained, always under the guise of asking how I was holding up with work, but always circling back to him, as if I might offer something that would let her sleep better at night. Some assurance that her precious boy wasn't really in trouble, that this was all some big misunderstanding that I, the responsible one, the capable one, could fix like I always had. What she didn't say, and what she didn't need to, was that in her eyes, his struggle was my failure. After all, I was the one who had brought him into that job. I was the one who had vouched for him. I answered her questions with polite deflections, careful not to reveal anything that would compromise the investigation, not because I owed her discretion, but because I wanted to see how far she would go without facts. I wanted to know whether her loyalty had any limits. And the answer came quicker than I expected. That Sunday, I went over for dinner, the way I sometimes did when guilt gnawed at me louder than pride. The table was set like always, too much food, too many folded napkins, wine that was always slightly too warm, and yet the atmosphere was different. Tighter. As if the air itself was waiting for something to happen. I sat down, smiled, and listened as Mom asked how work was going, her voice a shade too light, her eyes flickering toward my father, who said nothing as he spooned potatoes onto his plate. Eric wasn't there, which told me more than any email ever could. Halfway through the meal, she said it. Said it softly, but deliberately, like a surgeon drawing the first incision. Eric's been really stressed lately, she began, swirling her glass, not looking at me. He feels like he's under a microscope at work. Said some people are out to get him. I didn't respond. Not right away. I wanted to see if she'd dare say more. She did. I just think maybe this job wasn't a good fit for him after all. You know how he is. He needs encouragement, not pressure. Some people just aren't wired for corporate structure. The rage I felt wasn't loud. It didn't rise in my throat or tremble in my hands. It just sat there, heavy and certain, like a stone in my chest, because what she was really saying was clear. If he failed, it wasn't because he lied, or stole, or cheated. It was because I didn't coddle him enough. That night, after the dishes were cleared and Dad went out to smoke a cigar on the porch, I found myself alone in the kitchen with Grandma June. She moved slowly now, her joints stiff from time and age, but her mind was as sharp as it had ever been. She didn't say anything at first, just poured 2 mugs of tea, one for me, one for herself, and handed me mine without ceremony. You know, she said, settling into the chair across from me, I used to think silence was strength. I looked at her, unsure where she was going. I stayed silent for 40 years while your grandfather ran around on me. Knew every woman's name, every motel address, every lie. And still I smiled at church. Cooked his meals. Kept my mouth shut. People called me strong. She took a sip of tea, watching me. But strength without truth? That's just survival. And survival without dignity? That's a slow death. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. You're not me, she continued. And thank God for that. That conversation stayed with me long after I left the house that night, long after I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan spinning slow, rhythmic circles above me. It made me realize that my silence, my professionalism, my refusal to make a scene, wasn't some noble act of maturity. It was a survival mechanism I had inherited from women who had been trained to swallow fire their whole lives. But I didn't want to burn quietly anymore. I wanted them to feel the heat. The next morning, I walked into the office, nodded politely at the receptionist, and made my way straight to the HR department. I didn't knock. I didn't wait. I walked in, closed the door behind me, and said, "You've had enough time. Either handle this, or I will." And when I said that, I didn't mean I'd write another report. I meant I was going to make damn sure that the next time someone joked about me not lasting in a real job, they'd remember exactly how dangerous a woman can be when she's been underestimated for far too long. And if that made me the villain in my family's story, so be it. Better to be a villain with truth than a daughter buried in silence. There comes a moment in every long game, whether it's chess, corporate politics, or family dynamics, when patience stops being a virtue and transforms into a weapon, one honed not by haste or emotion, but by restraint so precise it becomes indistinguishable from calculation. And as I sat at my kitchen table late that Thursday night, sipping lukewarm tea and staring at the list of names on the upcoming performance review schedule, I understood that I had finally crossed that invisible line from silent endurance to strategic vengeance. It wasn't rage that moved me anymore. It was clarity, the slow, clean burn of seeing the truth so plainly that it no longer shocked you, only sharpened your next move. Eric's missteps had become more than mistakes. They were symptoms of something that had been growing in him for years, a belief reinforced by the people who raised us that failure could be softened, even erased, by charm, deflection, and the unspoken promise that someone else would absorb the cost. But I wasn't going to be that person anymore. Not at work, not in life, and certainly not at our parents' dining room table. The irony of it all, the bitter little joke that only I seemed to appreciate, was that the very structure my family dismissed as too rigid or too serious, my meticulousness, my obsession with detail, my inability to just relax, was the same mechanism that would bring him down without so much as a raised voice. I had spent over 15 years learning how to navigate corporate systems, policies, compliance frameworks, and interpersonal dynamics, not because I was particularly fascinated by logistics, but because structure had always been my only shield. While my brother moved through life cushioned by indulgence and second chances, I had been memorizing the rules not so I could play fair, but so I could win on my own terms, in a game they never even realized they were playing. So I planned the next family gathering with all the subtlety of a general preparing for battle. I suggested another game night, something low-key, just us, no drama, maybe a little pizza and wine to lighten the mood. My mother jumped at the idea, probably hoping it was some kind of peace offering, a sign that I was ready to let things go. Ready to smooth over whatever invisible rift had started to form between her golden boy and the daughter she'd never quite figured out how to love without qualifications. I told her I'd host this time. I said it would be easier, since I had the space. She offered to bring dessert. I told her not to worry. I'd take care of everything. And I did. The house was immaculate. Candles lit. Jazz low in the background. Wine chilled just enough to feel casual, but not cheap. Grandma June arrived first, her slow shuffle punctuated by the quiet clinking of the teacup and saucer she insisted on bringing with her wherever she went now, as though it were some talisman against chaos. She gave me a long look, a knowing one, and said nothing. She just sat in her usual chair, set her cup down, and waited. Eric showed up 20 minutes late, as always, but with just enough forced cheer in his voice to suggest that he believed the performance review had gone in his favor, that HR had either closed the investigation or, more likely, that someone had smoothed it over behind closed doors like they always had, sparing him once again from consequences he neither feared nor respected. He was wearing that same button-down shirt from the previous week, ironed this time, and brought a cheap bottle of Merlot in a half-hearted gesture that tried, and failed, to pass for civility. The games began innocently enough. Trivial Pursuit. Pictionary. The usual passive-aggressive jokes about who cheated last time, who always picks the easiest categories, who can't draw to save their life. But I waited. I let the evening settle into that familiar rhythm of fake laughter and old habits, and then, just when it seemed like everything was finally smoothing out, I asked him a question, casual, light, but sharp as glass beneath the surface. "So, how's work going?" I said, pouring another glass of wine as I leaned back in my chair, my voice steady and almost warm. He hesitated, just for a second, but then launched into some half-formed speech about team dynamics, how people don't always understand the bigger picture, and how some folks are just out to sabotage anyone who thinks differently. I nodded, asked him to elaborate, played dumb, pretended I didn't already know what he'd said in the HR meeting, didn't already have the full transcript of his pathetic attempt to spin his screw-up into a story of corporate persecution. My parents looked mildly uncomfortable, sensing the shift, but not quite sure what was happening yet. And that's when I opened the next box of the game. Not on the table, on my laptop, already connected to the TV screen behind us, ready to cast. I thought this might be fun, I said, and with one click, the screen lit up not with a game, but with a slideshow. Simple. Clean. Slide after slide of timestamped screenshots, audit trail data, report logs, digital signatures. All redacted of client names, all anonymized, all sanitized for legal safety, but unmistakably clear in their meaning. The room went still. Eric stared at the screen like it was speaking a language he had never learned, or perhaps one he'd pretended didn't exist. I turned to him slowly and smiled, the same smile he had tossed at me during that first game night when he joked about real jobs. Just thought we'd play a different kind of game tonight. This one's called accountability. My father stood up halfway through the slides, muttering something about needing air. My mother reached out as if to stop the presentation, but I was already ahead of her. Don't worry, it's nothing confidential. HR has already seen it all. I just thought it was time we all did. Eric didn't speak. He didn't defend. He didn't even move. Because in that moment, for the first time in his life, he realized he wasn't protected by proximity anymore. He realized that the person he dismissed as overbearing, uptight, and joyless had become something he never prepared for a threat. And then, in the middle of the stunned silence that followed, Grandma June lifted her teacup and said, with a calm that felt almost rehearsed, "That's checkmate, sweetheart." She didn't look at me when she said it. She looked at him. And for the first time in all the years I had known my brother, he had no smirk, no joke, no words. Just silence. The same silence I had lived in for decades. Only now it was his turn to sit in it. And I wasn't finished yet. It's a strange thing, how peace doesn't always come with the end of conflict, how sometimes the quiet that follows isn't comforting or triumphant, but unnervingly hollow, like stepping into a house after a fire and finding the structure still standing. But the warmth long gone, replaced by something brittle and permanent in its silence. That was exactly how the air felt the morning after the game night, or the reckoning, as I'd come to think of it, stale, too still, like the house itself knew what had happened and wasn't sure how to carry on. No one had called. Not my brother, not my mother, not even my father, and the absence of their voices, usually a dull static humming in the background of my life, felt oddly loud now, pressing against my thoughts in a way I hadn't expected. I thought I'd feel victorious, maybe even smug, but what settled in my chest wasn't satisfaction. It was something far heavier, harder to name, like grief, but colder, quieter, and laced with the bitter awareness that, in winning, I had finally confirmed what I had always feared deep down, that my family had never seen me clearly, and perhaps never would. I got the first text just after noon, 2 words from my father: "We need to talk." That was his style, always vague, always half-involved, a man who could deliver life-altering conversations with the emotional tone of a weather forecast. I didn't respond immediately. I wasn't ready to hear whatever half-baked plea he was about to deliver, likely something along the lines of, "You didn't have to go that far," or "You made your point, Natalie." As though protecting myself and my integrity had been some kind of exaggerated performance. When I did call him back later that evening, his voice was exactly as I'd expected, strained but firm, caught somewhere between paternal disappointment and diplomatic neutrality. He said they were hurt, not by the facts, of course, he couldn't dispute those, but by the way I had handled it, as if exposing the truth was more damaging than the lies themselves. "I just think you embarrassed everyone," he said, not angry, just tired, like a man who had long ago learned to survive by avoiding depth, by staying in the shallow end of every emotional pool. I listened, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to hear him say it, to hear the weight of their priorities so clearly laid out. Protect the image. Preserve the family unity. Sweep it all under the rug, as if rugs had never been lifted before and dirt never spilled out. I asked him, gently but firmly, what he would have had me do. Should I have stayed silent? Allowed my own name to be attached to fraud? Let Eric sink the very department I'd built from the ground up because it might bruise a few egos to hold him accountable? He didn't answer. Not directly. He's your brother, he said instead, as if that one statement negated everything else, as if shared blood were a blanket capable of warming betrayal into something forgivable. I hung up without another word. That was the last time we spoke. It was Grandma June who reached out next, not with advice or consolation, but with a question and a statement that landed with the weight of stone on my shoulders. She asked if I had time to drive her to the lake house, a property I hadn't thought about in years, an old place my grandparents had bought before I was born, used occasionally for holidays and summer weekends, and then abandoned slowly as everyone aged and priorities shifted. I agreed, partly because I couldn't say no to her, but partly because, in that moment, I wanted to be around someone who had chosen not to flinch when the truth was laid bare. Someone who had lifted her teacup and declared checkmate without a single tremble in her voice. The drive was long and quiet, the kind of quiet that isn't awkward but reflective, a silence shared between two people who have both lived lives defined by endurance and decided, at different times and for different reasons, to stop asking for permission to exist as they are. When we arrived, the house looked just as I remembered it, weathered but sturdy, the dock still intact, the pine trees lining the edge of the water like silent sentinels. She asked me to help her inside, moved slowly through the living room with her cane tapping rhythmically against the old wooden floors, and finally sat down at the kitchen table, the same one we used to play cards on when I was a teenager. "I'm changing the will," she said plainly, as if she were telling me the weather. I didn't respond, unsure what she meant or what it had to do with anything. "I'm leaving this place to you," she continued, "because you'll know what to do with it. Because you fight your battles alone, the way I always had to, and I'm tired of pretending that deserves nothing but pity. You've earned something that lasts." I wanted to tell her that I didn't need the lake house, that I didn't need anything, that what I wanted, what I had always wanted, was a family that saw me, not just used me as a mirror for their own insecurities. But I didn't say any of that, because for the first time, someone in my family wasn't asking me to be smaller. She was giving me space, quite literally, to be exactly who I had become, without condition. I stayed there that night, slept in the old upstairs bedroom with the faded quilt and the creaky windows, and in the morning, I sat on the dock with a cup of tea that wasn't nearly as good as Grandma's, but warm enough to keep the wind from biting. I thought about Eric, not with rage, but with something closer to detachment, as though he were a character in someone else's story, a man who had been given every tool for success and had used them to build excuses instead of bridges. I thought about my parents and how their love had always been wrapped in strings, how their comfort depended on my silence, how my strength had threatened their structure more than any of Eric's failings ever could. And then I thought about myself, sitting there with my spine straight and my palms steady, knowing that I had not only survived their judgment, but had reshaped it into something undeniable. I had spoken the truth. I had drawn the line. And while it hadn't brought me the kind of peace people write songs about, it had brought me something more honest, an ending and maybe, if I was careful, a beginning. Because revenge isn't always fire and fury, and vindication isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like an old woman changing her will. Sometimes it sounds like a brother with nothing left to say. Sometimes it feels like a quiet morning at the edge of a lake, the steam from your tea curling into the air as you wonder, not with fear, but with clarity, what comes next. And maybe, just maybe, Grandma knew that I would need the house for exactly this reason. Because some wars don't end. They just go quiet. And some victories aren't about winning, they're about refusing to lose ever again.